Okay, in this section, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of fertility awareness. Let's get right into it. So we're simplifying the process of conception to what's relevant to this course. So for the scope of this course, what's required for successful fertilization and implantation of the fertilized egg, aka the start of pregnancy, is limited to two things. The first of those is live sperm must reach the egg. The second of those is the lining of your uterus must be hospitable for implantation of the fertilized egg. While many factors influence healthy semen production in your partner, once semen is deposited into your vagina, there are four primary factors that impact a healthy sperm's successful travel to an egg for fertilization. The first of those is a hospitable pH. The second of those is a fluid environment. The third of those is the condition of your cervical opening, aka your cervical OS. And then the fourth of those is the presence of an egg. Seminal fluid has a pH between 7.2 to 7.8, so it's slightly basic on the pH scale. Sperm don't live for very long in environments outside of this pH range. And in fact, below a pH of 6.0, sperm typically die within a few hours. The pH of your girl parts varies based on which region we're looking at. So at the opening of your vagina out into the world, the pH range is typically around a pH of 3.9, so it's pretty acidic. As you move up your vagina, closer and closer to your cervix, at the base of your cervix, at the lower end of your cervix, you'll see the pH rise from about a pH of 3.9 up to about a pH of 5.7. Moving through your cervix into the base of your uterus, there's another pH shift, a pretty rapid one across your cervix. And now we're at much closer to a physiologic pH of 7.1. So we've moved ever so slightly basic on the pH scale, 7 being neutral. And then as you continue to move up your uterus, closer and closer to your fallopian tubes, the pH continues to shift and become more and more basic, up to about a pH of 7.7. And this is really important because when your partner ejaculates inside of you, his sperm are deposited into the upper part of your vagina. And his seminal fluid, typically around a pH of 7.1 to 8.0, alters your vaginal pH. The quantity and quality of his seminal fluid combined with the quality and quantity of your cervical fluid create an environment where sperm can survive for long enough to swim through your cervical opening, and the technical term for this is cervical OS, and into your uterus, which is a much more hospitable environment for sperm. Once inside your uterus, the pH conditions are hospitable enough for sperm to survive for up to 5 days. And so this is why whenever you have sex, you can assume, or you should assume to be on the safe side, that those sperm will be alive for 5 days, assuming that they've made it through your cervical opening, which leads us to the next point of this conversation. In the center of your cervix, there's an opening known as the cervical OS. During much of your cycle, the opening is mostly closed and it's fairly rigid because your cervix is actually fairly hard during most of your cycle. The opening is also typically blocked by sticky quality cervical secretions that make it nearly impossible for seminal fluid and sperm to penetrate. However, during your fertile window and also during your period, this opening is larger and softer because your cervix itself is softer. And the condition of your cervical fluid is different during your fertile window. And so sperm's ability to travel through that cervical opening is typically aided by those more liquid and copious quantities of cervical secretions. Once sperm are inside your uterus, they need to swim up to your fallopian tubes and enter the one that's releasing that month's egg in order to have a chance of successfully fertilizing an egg. Once the sperm have entered your fallopian tube, they attach to the lining of the tube for about 24 hours. And during this time, a couple of key modifications are made to the sperm that make it able to fertilize an egg. Once those modifications take place, the sperm breaks away from the lining of the fallopian tube and it continues to travel up the tube in search of an egg. If you aren't close to ovulation, when the sperm enter your fallopian tube, and this is, again is assuming that the sperm were even lucky enough to make it through your cervix, then there's no egg present for fertilization. So how do fertility awareness methods work? Well, throughout your cycle, your hormones fluctuate. Before you ovulate, estrogen surges to stimulate release of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is the hormone that stimulates release of the dominant follicle, which is this month's egg from your ovary. Every single one of the fertility awareness methods that we'll talk about rely on detecting that estrogen surge so that you know when your fertile window opens. Because the thing with that estrogen surge is it occurs far enough in advance of when you ovulate to be able to confidently know when your fertile window opens. And this is critical because, once again, if you aren't aware of these changes that are going on with your cervical fluid or these changes that are going on with your cervix, then if a sperm winds up being able to make it through your cervix because you're approaching ovulation, then there's problems, because we've got that sperm is viable for up to 5 days once inside your uterus. Now, once you've ovulated, the leftover hull or shell of the dominant follicle begins releasing progesterone. And this causes your basal body temperature to spike so that you know that your fertile window is now closed. So basal body temp is essentially the best way of knowing when your fertile window closes. And this is during a normal cycle when you actually release an egg. The only exception to this would be during an anovulatory cycle. We'll talk about how to know when your fertile window closes in an anovulatory cycle in a different part or a different chapter. So by knowing when your fertile window opens and also when it closes, you're able to avoid pregnancy through abstinence. So avoiding penis and vagina sex during your fertile window, or you're able to choose barrier methods for contraception during your fertile window. And here also, Toni Weschler, who I'll talk more about Toni Weschler. She is a FAM instructor, and here FAM being used for the symptothermal method. So for the cervical fluid monitoring plus basal body temp monitoring, she is a FAM instructor for the symptothermal method. And she highly encourages her couples who are using fertility awareness for contraception to either abstain from sex entirely. And here, whenever I say sex, just know it's penis and vagina sex during their fertile windows, or to use 2 barrier methods every time they have sex during their fertile window. And so she talks about the use of a condom plus a diaphragm, for instance, during the fertile window. So anyways, and this is just an added, because her stance is if a barrier method is going to fail, it's going to fail when you're most fertile. So just some food for thought here. Now, which fertility awareness method is right for you? Once we talk about the basics of each one of these, and there will be a module covering each one of these, then we'll talk about what to consider before deciding which FAM method is right for you, and how to modify the method for your comfort. And comfort here is synonymous with risk level for possible contraception. So how How risky are you okay with? And we'll talk about ways that you're able to modify each of these methods to achieve a greater degree of confidence in the combination of methods that you're choosing to use in order to avoid pregnancy. All right. Now, there are 3 ways to determine your fertile window. The first of those is monitoring your cervical fluid quality plus your basal body temperature. This together is known as the symptothermal method. And as I've mentioned previously, oftentimes it's those 2 plus monitoring the position of your cervix that together is called the symptothermal method. This is the method that's also known as the Billings method. It also goes by some additional names. It's kind of the traditional fertility awareness method. Then we'll talk about monitoring your conductivity, and here conductivity of both your saliva and your vaginal secretions, along with your basal body temperature, as a means of fertility awareness. And then third, we'll talk about tracking your hormones at home, along with your tracking your basal body temperature for knowing the opening and the close of your fertile window. Once we talk about each of these, we'll also talk about some FDA approved apps